So welcome back. First order of business. My assistant is still sick, but this show has been on the road for a while now, so I gotta keep it moving. She's gonna come back when she's gonna come back, you know what I mean? I've had so much coffee today and I still don't feel energized. Anyway, today's topic is surrealism, and surrealism in particular from a perspective of what it was created for and not what it became. We are going to talk about what it actually became over time and what people think of it now, what kind of ideas they have whenever they hear the word surrealism and all of that. First and foremost, we gotta set up the time frame, right? So this is a movement that started after World War I in Europe. When people hear the word surrealism, they mostly think of dreams of trippy type of paintings mostly. And it is actually really interesting to me that paintings and this style of painting of surrealism has become so famous to compare to all the other stuff that's been within that movement. Surrealism is related to Dada, and we've talked about Dada art a little bit before. One of the things that's actually true about this whole conversation about, or popular discourse about surrealism or what kind of reputation it has, it is true that it's about dreams. It is true that it's about the subconscious. It is true that it is about trying to unlock something within your subconscious that's not inhibited by the superego. One of the biggest artists, at least the biggest in terms of the most famous artists that came out of surrealism, is of course Salvador Dali, and I'm sure you're aware of him. However, it is kind of really interesting that he was not instrumental in the creation of surrealism. He actually got kicked out from the surrealist movement altogether, which is something that I honestly agree with in terms of the decision by Breton and all of them who were in that subgroup of surrealism, because it makes a lot of sense that they wouldn't want to fuck with that guy when their philosophy and their politics differ so much. In any case, it's really interesting, in my opinion, that surrealism is oftentimes only associated with the subconscious, especially with Freud, you know, which is what I've been kind of told in classes, what we focused on. We also talked about myths and primitivism and its influence on it. We've also talked about photography, because photography is at the core of surrealism in terms of the medium of choice for most of the artists that were involved in it. It's interesting that even those artists that were working in painting and photography, mostly their paintings are the ones that are known and not the photography. And also this look, this signature look of Salvador Dali, at least the way that people talk about him or about surrealism, they always bring him up and they always say that, oh, his style is the one that everyone remembers, when in reality, to be fair about this style of painting, specifically the way that the brushstrokes are looking, the way that perspective can be expansive and claustrophobic at the same time, really weird lines in terms of the way that the objects are arranged in the foreground and background, all of those things are actually something that started with Giorgio de Chirico, and specifically metaphysical art. If you look up metaphysical art, you're going to be like, oh, that looks like surrealism. And yes, like you'd be correct because it is basically a style that was dreamlike already and had a lot of high contrast of light and shadow, a lot of really intense chiaroscuro. And I think that it's interesting to see with this art movement, with metaphysical art, that a lot of the paintings that are referenced to kind of show where this style came from, they were painted in 1910, for example. So about 14 years before the Surrealist Manifesto was even published. Either one of them, by the way, because we have this really weird situation going on with Surrealists where they could not agree on one view of what surrealism actually is. And I would argue honestly that most people who have this movement and they write manifestos, they rarely have a very clear idea of what their movement is, and sometimes they write this manifesto that technically is just a rehash of something else and they just don't even realize it, which is fine, I guess, like who cares. But I think with surrealism it was especially pronounced because there were two people who wrote a manifesto within the same month and the same year and got it published, which was kind of confusing, I'd say, for a lot of people to actually decide which manifesto is the manifesto and why those two groups were even separated and other things like that. One of them was led by André Breton and the other one was Ivan Gol, and they basically just published manifestos literally 2 weeks apart, and Ivan guy was the first one. However, Breton's work is the one that's kind of considered to be the Surrealist Manifesto. So I would say that usually when people just talk about a Surrealist Manifesto, especially when they talk about the first one, because there's another one and then a revision and whatever, they're usually talking about that one, about the Breton version. One of those things about Surrealism that should be mentioned, even if you know about Surrealism or if you just heard of it or whatever, I definitely do need to mention that the movement was focusing a lot on automatism. And automatism is a specific type of approach or tool or practice that is used to create artworks by surrealists. Basically things that you do unconsciously. Automatism is oftentimes just done randomly, something that you do without thinking about it. And it's kind of theorized, or was theorized by surrealists, that it would bring out this id kind of unbridled by the super ego, where you would be kind of letting your subconscious lead the way, and it would be showing something that is more authentic, I guess, than what you could create if you were adhering to a lot of these rules that we have created in the world. I think it's a lot of assumptions, to be honest, because that's how I felt in university anyway, when I was looking at these artworks, and also when I was talking to people who practiced automatism or automatic painting or drawing or whatever the hell, sculptures. Sometimes it's like, the crumpling of paper artworks. I genuinely do not think that it is a solid enough theory in terms of just like scientifically proving that these artworks were in any type of way showing anything that authentic about you. And also, I don't think that it's entirely possible to make something without your conscious mind participating in it at all. I think it's kind of a little bit too up in the air, and it's easier to understand why surrealists were so serious about trying to create a new way or a more authentic way, or to see the world without these kind of rules of, like what is proper, religion, states, other things like that. And it's all kind of coming down to the fact that we are talking about people that were functioning in between two of the most devastating wars for Europe, the entirety of it really. And a lot of people who were participating in this art movement were people who participated or were, drafted into a war before. And many of them had their own ideas as to how they could push back to this weird ass ideology that's been taking root consistently, not going away even when you're trying to eradicate it, and which is fascism. One of the things that I was not really taught in school that much, I think that people kind of, like, at least my professors glossed over it, but it's impossible not to talk about this topic. I personally would love to talk about it anyway, obviously, but it's just really strange to me that they wouldn't mention it. The whole point of surrealism was not about exploring dreams and kind of being obsessed with the dream world in general, or trying to make artworks that are all about this subconscious, as much as it was about trying to come up with a new way of seeing the world and imagining a world that exists outside of these rules that current generations were familiar with, kind of like trying to see what France would be like, for example, without colonialism, without going to other countries and exploiting them and stuff like that, which is all ideas that were very, very socialist. And especially with André Breton, he was a very vocal communist, and it is interesting to see how this informed this movement, because I genuinely, when I heard about surrealism and I learned about it a bit in school, I was taught about it from a perspective of photography mostly, or it was kind of like the most important medium for it, because it was kind of the medium to get into at that time. It was 1920s and 30s, and photography was still new and fresh, let's say that way, to compare to painting. A lot of it is also grounded, right? Like it's a picture of reality. And if you can learn how to manipulate it and inject something strange into those photographs, it's kind of more powerful than just random pictures that you paint, because strange imagery in painting is more expected than in photography, especially when it wasn't a time where you can just like, Photoshop shit and whatever. The political side of it kind of went over my head. I think it was mostly because it wasn't mentioned that much. But to me now, knowing more about this movement, it seems very strange that they did not get into it and did not talk about it. Because if you really get into it, you immediately understand that Salvador Dali is not that much of a surrealist, really. At least if we take Breton's ideas of it. I feel like it's not aligned at all, obviously. If you know, and if you don't know, I'm going to tell you, Salvador Dali is known for his weird-ass glorification of fascism and Hitler and all of that kind of shit. He was a strange fella, and the reason why he is so prominent today, and this is just my theory, I don't know what scholars on this topic think. This is my personal theory as to why he's so big today. And it is because it is the only artist from the surrealist pool. I mean, not the only one, I guess, but who was really good at taking that aesthetic and reproducing it, especially in painting. And he is non-committal enough to his own freaky ideas to the point where he just looks like a fool a little bit, or like a madman, So a lot of his political views, even though they lean right, I personally think they do. There's like way too much evidence and way too many actions that he's done that no one who's moderate would ever do. Based on all of that, it's really not a shocking thing that in our time, when the capital runs everything, that he would be one of the favorite artists of this current world, kind of like Picasso, right? He is a good toy that could be reproduced. His artwork is perfect for investment. It is just a thing to invest into, to pass around, and it doesn't have any artistic value anymore. It only has monetary value, and this is kind of perfect for anyone in our times, especially because a lot of people have this weird not only tolerance but understanding and compassion, and even sometimes camaraderie when it comes to fascist bullshit. And I think that with this guy, it's just very much at the forefront. I personally think that it's kind of like, yeah, he was friends with people who were openly fascist. He kept on saying, like, what's the big deal when he got kicked out by Breton out of the Surrealist movement, because Surrealist movement was largely communist and left-wing. He was kind of being like, what's the big deal? And in that case, I just look at him and I think that boy is stupid. Like, he's just a little bit not there entirely in terms of just getting the big picture and realizing that like if you're picking a philosophical and political movements that are literally the opposite of the group that you belong to, yeah, they'll be kind of pissy about it. Come on now. So he is not really fitting into this whole idea of trying to find a new way of looking at the world and trying to come up with something that would change their current society. Now, did surrealism change current society and actually succeed in what they were trying to do, which is create a world that is not run by rabid white supremacists? No. We know that already. We're living it now. But I think it is interesting to see how warped the idea of surrealism has become. While at the same time, I think that if we are going to be talking about photography and we're going to be talking about the artworks that became very well known as surrealists, for example, if we talk about Incre's Violin by Man Ray, was made in 1924, it could be argued which one it belongs to, whether it's like Dada or surrealism, whatever. It doesn't really fucking matter. They're close together. If you need a political kind of alignment to understand it better, because art was very political back then, and honestly it should still be, and it is, but if you need those alignments, Dada was more anarchist and Surrealism was more communist. So regardless of all of that, these artworks were quite strange because of how crude they were, and they were always, once again, steeped in misogyny, which never makes any fucking sense to me, because how are you trying to come up with a new way to look at the world? How are you trying to fight against fascism when you're not seeing the entirety of this picture? Like, you're not actually grasping the problem of half of the population. It's just never clicking, honestly. And in some way, I also think that a lot of things are obviously going to be quite contradictory when it comes to surrealism, because you have this art movement and this manifesto that is largely trying to get away from anything that is descriptive in a sense of just naming things around you, for example, or creating something that is very easily understood. This art movement that is based around the automatic creation and trying to pull out this new ways of seeing the world, relying on dreams and subconscious. It is revealing bias, obviously, which is in one way is a good thing, because we do need to see our biases. However, it seems like they did not see the irony in it at all, which is kind of really, really surprising to me, I guess. But we're also going to talk about Dora Maar when it comes to Dada and surrealist photography, because her work is really interesting to talk about, especially like that weird elephant-looking picture that she took. Dora Maar is oftentimes known as just Picasso's muse, when in reality she was an artist that was very prominent at the time. She was she was quite instrumental to a lot of the developments in photography and a lot of other denominations of Dada and surrealist movements. In any case, when it comes to just the history of surrealism, we kind of have to look at both of the surrealist manifestos and see how Breton and Gall went about it, where their real rivalry was really strange, in my opinion, because we kind of, again, this movement, all about this breaking of boundaries and diving deep and trying to pull out the most id you could pull out while being conscious. And it is so strange to see that these two guys were so at each other's throats, literally, that they even had a physical altercation. Of course, let me quickly give you this Breton definition of surrealism, because it's really short and it is kind of one of those most quoted pieces from the whole manifesto on surrealism. It's honestly quite difficult to read because it's created in a surrealist fashion. Like, even the manifesto is written in a very surrealist way, and the only things that are very, very coherent are probably a bit of comments about the way that literary works outside of surrealism are written and kind of being like pissy about it. So Breton brings up Dostoevsky's description of a room, and he's kind of like, why would I want to read that? Like, why would I want to read about the type of wood that this chair was made out of or whatever? And it's like really interesting to me, because it's kind of it's contradictory, in my opinion, even though some of those ideas from surrealist movement, I kind of really get what they were trying to do. Pure psychic automatism, by which it is intended to express, either verbally or in writing, the true function of thought. Thought dictated in the absence of all control exerted by reason and outside of all aesthetic or moral preoccupations. It was strange because there was a lot of this like weird ownership that they wanted over the term, which in many ways I do not quite understand, because like I think I think that it makes sense to be like maybe a bit salty that someone is trying to steal your shit, or like your quote or your work or your style or the name of a movement or whatever. But it's also interesting that it's kind of incompatible, philosophically speaking, in my opinion, to be both pro id and pro unbridled type of creation and pro questioning of everything and creating outside of any norms or any reservations. At the same time, saying something as crazy as like you can't be claiming to be a surrealist unless you're doing it this specific way, which is like I understand that, like, words have meaning and movements have their own definitions, let's say that way. However, it is strange to be so militant about a term which is referring to a movement like this in general, right? Like if it's someone who's like not a real surrealist, for example, right? In your opinion as Breton, just say so. Just be like, yeah, I don't think they're like real surrealists. Why do you gotta threaten them over it? That's what's kind of so funny to me about that. Maybe there was some kind of worry about the wrong type of politics being attached to it, kind of like with Salvador Dali, because as far as I understand, at first there was this manifesto released with a whole list of names of old artists who are kind of calling themselves surrealists, who are working under this type of umbrella. And then Breton had to have this whole kind of trial situation where he just kind of like asked everyone as to where they draw the line of the political side of things. And surrealists were firmly on the left side, and many of them, while they were working on surrealism, they kind of felt like it wasn't as impactful as it should be, and they especially started to feel it later on, the closer they were to Second World War, for obvious reasons, because they felt the whole thing of fascism blowing up to such huge proportions and just taking over minds all over the place. So they kind of felt like their actions were not radical enough, and they were kind of talking to themselves. So they left the surrealist bubble and went to the communist route, where you would actually be doing some kind of action when it comes to political movements, right? And if you go by these definitions and by how important it was for real, in quotation, surrealists to have this particular political leanings, which I think were really important, because if people were actually pushing back in huge numbers, maybe we wouldn't have as big of a fucking tragedy as 5 years of brutal war in Europe. But it is what it is, like white supremacy is has deep roots, and it's like a fucking octopus with all the tentacles just like sticking out of different places. Same with like apartheid states, you're just always surprised. You're always like, there's no way a tentacle has been far up this thing's ass this entire time and I didn't know. And like you just keep finding it. You just keep looking for a reason why something isn't working, and you're always stumbling upon the same fucking thing. Anyway, with many people who talk about surrealism, you will see a lot of conversation about, especially when you're reading stuff in English, it's a lot of people who are talking about this movement and being like, well, when someone was taking only things that weren't too radical, it was working. And then that's all bullshit, honestly. Like, if you have a problem with automatism, you have a problem with automatism. If you have a problem with the id and with the whole idea of bringing out this id to the surface and actually making artwork that's not controlled by the superego, whatever, if you have a problem with this concept, you have a problem with most surrealists, and it has nothing to do with their radical politics, because their politics were kind of what they believed in concrete world, and the surrealist approach to art making was trying to figure out a way of coming up with a new world where you would be seeing the world function differently. It's kind of like talking to somebody who was raised in the deep south of America about a way of living that wouldn't be built around capitalism, and they would tell you that it's just not possible because they genuinely don't know that it is a thing that we came up with a few hundred years ago, just a few, the way that we know it today, right after the industrialization. So if you think about their approaches, they're just trying to come up with different types of making of art that could bring out something new or whatever. And the reason why it seems like mumbo jumbo to us now is because we don't take Freud as seriously as they used to. Now we talk about Freud as a framework of history and talking about how we actually arrived at a lot of other theories within psychology and within biology and psychiatry. But we start with him because he just challenged so many notions of our understanding of the mind that a lot of people spend their entire lives disproving his shit and actually finding something that worked. Now, it is really weird to see people consistently conflating the political movement that is so deeply entrenched in the material realities of everyday people and thinking that surrealists and their approach to art was not a way of trying to open up people's minds to a different way of thinking, but a direct, not even correlation, but a copy or a functional diagram of how that political movement is supposed to work. That those two things are separate. They're connected only through the fact that this art making was supposed to trigger more of new and more experimental thought, I guess. And the reason why you can see that a lot of these artworks and a lot of these artists, like even the fact that I've read like some articles about people kind of criticizing art exhibitions and whatever and talking about it. And a lot of them, when they're talking about a surrealist exhibition, it's funny that they're oftentimes talking about how the only good surrealists are those who never joined, and oftentimes focusing on the fact that they have a distaste for left-leaning politics, which is always so funny to me. Like, they will take Dalí with open arms. They will embrace him, promote him, reproduce his works on every fucking mug imaginable, but they will not be chill with anyone who was like, actually, I want real egalitarian society. Isn't it weird? I mean, it's not really weird, but I'm just saying, like, if you are a person who lives within this idea of shaking in your boots over left-leaning politics, but you're like reacting like, oh, he was just exploring it when it comes to Salvador Dali and right-wing politics, I need you to take a break and maybe reflect a little bit, because it's just really weird. The impact of Red Scare on our current society is really, really, really weird, where people can't even see beyond what they've been told and think about different types of ideologies and which ones are clearly not only not applicable or whatever, like they could be applied, all of them technically speaking, but are dangerous in a sense of actually being disgusting at its core in terms of the philosophy, the ideas, the type of view that you have to have on the world and on the people. And I'm talking about fascism right now, obviously. You have to be like sick in the head to be chill with it. And I think it's just really interesting that a lot of people are trying to avoid the conversation of all of those artists trying to resolve this issue that was upcoming in Europe. And I think that we're going to have to talk about again when I'm going to be talking about this new exhibition at Vancouver Art Gallery. It's called Eastern Bloc, I think. Art from the 60s and 80s. You should look it up. Just get prepared, okay? Because we're going to have a discussion. That I went to a press event. Like, I went on a tour of the exhibition with the curator, and I was disappointed, to say the least, because of, like, regardless of your political leanings, the works that were chosen, the way that they were presented and stuff like that, it just was so reductionist, and it wasn't good at all. But we're gonna have to talk about this in a different episode. We went together with my assistant, and we were shocked to say the least. But basically, surrealism, even though it had good ideas in terms of trying to really explore and come up with new ways of seeing things, it's at the same time was made inept by the lack of true structure, by the fact that the core of the movement is about the unconscious, which is not controlled. You can't control a movement that's supposed to be built around the concept of not being able to control something or not controlling something willfully. And on top of all of that, I think that in many ways, any leftist man that you talk to who is not subconsciously, not even consciously, but subconsciously, if he doesn't feel the urgency of addressing the issues of misogyny and of this type of, gender violence and stuff like that, if they don't see how this needs to be ratified immediately and should have been ratified a long time ago, if they don't see this shit, there's no point in, like, there's no hope basically for those people in that movement. You're excluding half of the population even when you're consciously thinking of them. There's oftentimes this weird shit, like specifically with surrealists, for example, where they are leftist and they were 1924, 30s was their like peak, right? It's a time when, like, in Soviet Union, women were already voting for like 10, 15 years, whatever, after the revolution already. And Lenin's wife was in charge of all education in the entirety of the country and bringing up the reading comprehension and literacy in general, which they did in like 2 years or some shit, like something crazy. I could not believe it. But honestly, I mean, if you actually decide to get all the people who can read to teach the rest who cannot and do it quickly, and make it your priority, you can actually make a lot of progress. It's just we're taught to see every problem that we have as unfixable. That's why Surrealists wanted to explore this subconscious level of thinking, because they were like, we see everything as set in stone, as not fixable. Is it actually, right? Like, let's try and figure out how we can trigger that thinking that is actually imaginative and new and outside of these norms that we have created that kind of dictate what we think is possible and what isn't. Regardless of all of that, it is lost cause when you look at artists who are saying that they want to explore something new or whatever, and what they come up with is misogyny. Not all surrealists had that type of work permeating everything that they were doing, but it was still there here and there. And even some of the proto or pre-surrealists, like, for example, what was his name? Guillaume Apollinaire, I think, bitch, I don't know. Yes, that guy. He like made one of the literary works that are technically considered to be feminist, and it was in 1917. I don't know. I think it's just really strange to encounter this type of thinking in real life, seeing how these ideals sometimes don't transfer to every type of person, and people get stuck in only seeing one thing or the other. So when I'm looking at their artworks and I'm trying to see what they were trying to get at when they're showing their artworks, there's supposed to be some kind of unconscious thing, and then it's just kind of weirdly like misogynistic. You're like, what the fuck, dude? What the hell happened? So, for example, if we talk about, well, let's start with the Man Ray Ingres's violin, a photo of a woman's back, and it's kind of like made into a violin, whatever the hell. Oftentimes, when you look at people speaking about this artwork, they're kind of getting lost in the sauce, in my opinion, because they start talking about the, like, mimesis, that whole I don't really love when people bring up mimesis in general, just because unless you're in a lecture hall, I don't want to hear you say mimesis. Like, come on now. You can use a different word. We're not here to impress each other with 300 words for the same fucking thing, right? But regardless, a lot of people kind of talk about this artwork as like, oh my god, it's breaking down the plane. You kind of start thinking whether it's actually tattooed on her, whether it is some kind of, and this is just popular interpretation. I'm not talking about like the true interpretations or whatever the hell, because the thing is, I kind of don't really believe in one true interpretation, like to that extreme, especially with works that are from movements like surrealism, where they're kind of doing a lot of things that are not fully thought out, obviously, because it's like the whole point, kind of experimentation with combining two things like a back and violin, and to us nowadays, this doesn't seem interesting at all, because we see this type of, double visual meaning or using of different signifiers and whatever. We're kind of used to it, so it doesn't seem interesting at all. And as per usual, this model is his lover too, and it's just it's always gonna stink of the male limitations, like oftentimes I have to find the limited amount of information about artists that were like female artists that were working in that same space or were contributing to it in one way or another, because at least usually their works are a bit more interesting and not as limited in terms of just being like, oh, it's about the erotic. And it's just I have only so much I can tolerate, like I'm not a very patient person, and so oftentimes you kind of try to find something else about that artwork that's quite famous, right? And it's technically just eroticism or an exploration of signifiers and mimesis. And another work that kind of gives you that same vibe. Not the same vibe, actually. It's a lot worse, I think. Personally, is Han Belmer. He is, I'm gonna give you, like, the artwork is the doll, and it's I do not love this work because it is so, like, it's literally chopped up body, basically. So for example, there's like writing about it, introduces the idea a little bit about the sexualization. So Belmer complicates this discourse by sexualizing and dismembering his dolls. The dolls are a symbol of erotic desire, but also of erotic violence. By committing a violent act on a figure that is already inanimate, killing the doll through hanging and dismembering, Belmer makes the relationship between person and object even more fraught psychologically. His work points deeply towards a surrealist impulse to manifest unconscious drives unapologetically through artwork. I don't agree with this description because sometimes you just gotta call violent shit that's annoying annoying. Sometimes you can just look at the work and be like, that's not genius, that's just annoying. And I wish more people were like this because oftentimes when people are just calling art annoying, it's something like, oh, it's abstract art, it's annoying. But they don't see that manifest themselves in their works quite clearly. I don't think there's a way to see this in any other way. It's kind of like our conversation about the super flat, you know? I can give you the benefit of doubt. I can look through your, you know, I can look through all of your fucking works and still arrive at this uneasy feeling of like, ew, bitch, figure yourself out. Like, this is weird. And I understand that a lot of artworks are dealing with the weird and with the strange and with the unsettling, which is fine. It's just really strange that it's always aimed in the same direction with them, with male artists in particular. It's always violent and it's always sexual and it's always in the one fucking direction. It's so tiring, exhausting, and annoying, and I wish they would stop making art forever because I think we've had enough. Anyway, this is my take on some of the good and some of the bad ideas of surrealism. Someday we'll talk more about it or about specific artworks. I think about Dora Maar, I forgot to get into that whole thing, but I feel like it's just not enough time to get into it properly. So we'll talk about Dora Maar separately because I actually find it really fascinating the way that she responded to Picasso's paintings of her and her own works, like what she's been looking into and what she's been exploring with her artworks. We'll talk about all of that some other time. Kisses. Bye.